Right now, it's May 7th, 2026, and the entire educational landscape is literally facing an unprecedented crisis. We're watching a live, unfolding scenario with Canvas, the platform that runs roughly 36% of higher education in North America. If you've been following the news, you know finals week has been thrown into complete and utter chaos. But in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how this happened, step by step, using the actual structural mechanics that most of the headlines are totally missing. 275 million. I mean, let that sink in for a second. That is the number of individual student records compromised in what is now officially the largest education data breach in human history. We're talking about 3.65 terabytes of deeply sensitive data ripped from nearly 9,000 schools. And that includes every single Ivy League institution in the US. And, we aren't just talking about a list of email addresses and student IDs here. A breach of this magnitude means billions of private messages between students and professors, highly sensitive mental health and disability notes, financial aid profiles, even personal admissions essays. It's all just out in the open.
So it really begs the question, how exactly does one single software vendor take down 9,000 completely separate educational institutions all at once? To understand why operations were completely derailed from the Ivy League all the way down to local school districts, we have to look past the surface-level panic. We need to uncover the actual mechanics of the attack, which really comes down to the very architecture of modern enterprise software.
Section 1, the Finals Week Hack. Let's start with the immediate, visceral impact of what students are actually experiencing today.
Imagine you're a student sitting down in a library or your dorm room right now. You log in to take a crucial final exam that literally determines your graduation, but you don't find your test. Instead, the entire Canvas login page has been totally defaced by a notorious cybercrime syndicate known as ShinyHunters. They overwrote the portal with this stark HTML message, basically telling university administrations across the continent that they have until exactly May 12th to negotiate a ransom. If they don't, their students' most private data gets dumped directly onto a public leak site on the dark web.
The timeline of this is just wild. We're talking about an escalation that went from a quiet corporate security response to an unprecedented nationwide extortion campaign in just one single week. On April 30th, Instructure, the massive parent company behind Canvas, detects the initial intrusion. 3 days later, on May 3rd, the hackers publicly claim the breach. Instructure's forced to go public on the 5th. But then, on May 7th, ShinyHunters does something uniquely terrifying. By defacing the login pages, they demonstrated active control over the systems. And in doing that, they brilliantly shifted the ransom pressure away from the corporate vendor and dropped it squarely onto the shoulders of individual universities and their terrified students.
Section 2, unpacking the supply chain. So the really crucial point to grasp here is how the hackers gained access to so many unrelated organizations simultaneously. How do you hit Penn State, Harvard, and Wake County Public Schools in one single blow?
Well, your intuition probably tells you that a massive, well-funded university has its own heavily guarded server room, right? Physically isolated from the rest of the world. But in the modern software landscape, that is just not how it works anymore. Schools simply rent what's called a logical tenant, which is basically a partitioned, invisible room inside Instructure's massive, centralized cloud infrastructure. The physical storage drives, the underlying databases, the authentication walls that check your passwords, they're all shared resources. It's designed to cut costs and maximize efficiency, but it creates a massive target.
By hacking Instructure, ShinyHunters didn't have to exhaust their resources breaking into 9,000 schools individually. They just hit the middle node, and all those downstream schools came along automatically. This right here is the exact definition of a software-as-a-service supply chain attack. Why break into thousands of separate vaults when you can just compromise the company that built the vaults and holds the master key? If you've ever wondered why a breach at some random third-party company you've never even heard of ends up affecting your personal apps, this is exactly why. It's a proven, incredibly effective playbook.
Section 3, the extortion playbook. Let's dig into who is actually pulling the strings here and the repeatable method they're using, because ShinyHunters definitely didn't invent this out of thin air.
This is the result of a highly efficient operational alliance, sometimes called the Trinity of Chaos. They literally split the dirty work into 4 distinct steps. First, front-end social engineering groups, like Scattered Spider, they pick up the phone, literally voice phishing by impersonating IT staff to trick a lower-level help desk worker into handing over their credentials. Once they're in, step 2 is compromising third-party integrations or OAuth tokens.
An OAuth token is basically a digital handshake that lets different apps talk to each other without needing a password every single time. Steal that handshake and you have VIP access to the massive data warehouses. Finally, ShinyHunters takes over the backend, quietly exfiltrating terabytes of data, spinning up the leak sites, and managing the ruthless extortion negotiations.
For these criminal economists, the math is just too good to pass up. They are systematically working their way up the food chain of B2B software vendors. They've hit Snowflake, they've hit Salesforce, now they've hit Instructure. As long as the software industry keeps consolidating services to cut overhead, creating these massive single points of failure, this extortion pipeline is going to remain incredibly lucrative.
Section 4. The systemic failures. Because honestly, it's not just about the hackers. It's about the broader financial and regulatory environment that basically rolls out the red carpet for them.
$4.8 billion. That's the all-cash amount private equity giant KKR paid to acquire Instructure back in November of 2024. And as the source material points out, private equity acquisitions inherently bring aggressive cost discipline and a huge push for rapid revenue growth to ensure return on that massive investment. They often optimize for EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. To hit those aggressive EBITDA targets, non-revenue-generating departments are heavily scrutinized, and in the software world, cybersecurity is generally viewed on the ledger as a pure, cuttable cost center. In fact, it's worth noting that Instructure has now been breached by ShinyHunters twice in just 8 months under this ownership.
And then there's the regulatory side, which is honestly kind of wild. The main federal law that's supposed to protect student records, FERPA, was written all the way back in 1974. We are relying on a legal framework from an era when student files literally lived in physical manila folders inside locked metal file cabinets. The idea that one single software vendor could lose the records of hundreds of millions of students in a single afternoon, that was completely inconceivable to Congress in the 70s. Because the law hasn't been properly modernized, students don't even have a private right of action to sue under FERPA for a massive cloud breach like this.
So when you put all that together, the conclusion is staggering. Breaching a major edtech vendor is currently a highly profitable business decision for criminal attackers and, strangely, a financially manageable expense for the breached companies. When the regulatory fines amount to just a tiny fraction of a company's total revenue and the risk of massive class action lawsuits is mitigated by critically outdated laws, the systemic pressure you'd need to force companies to truly secure these platforms simply isn't there.
Section 5. Winners, losers, and you. So, who actually comes out on top in this mess, and who ultimately pays the price?
The ledger here is completely counterintuitive. You would naturally think the cyber insurance industry loses when these massive payouts happen, but breaches of this magnitude actually allow them to justify skyrocketing premiums across the entire sector. Identity security vendors, they see an immediate surge in sales as terrified executives rush out to buy better defenses. The real losers are the millions of students. Their private lives and sensitive documents are now sitting in permanent criminal databases, leaving them indefinitely exposed to hyper-targeted AI-generated phishing attacks for the rest of their careers.
So what do you actually do? Here is the critical, actionable advice you need to implement today. First, you just have to operate under the assumption that your records are in this breach. If you get an email from a professor or administrator asking you to click a link for an urgent final exam study guide or a tuition update, stop. Do not click it. Call the school's official number directly to verify. Change any passwords you've reused across other sites, even if the vendor claims passwords weren't part of the stolen data. And seriously, consider freezing your credit or your child's credit. Identity theft from educational breaches can quietly haunt students for years before they even realize their credit is destroyed.
We've seen how the cloud architecture, the private equity economics, and these hopelessly outdated 1970s laws all stack up to make these catastrophic breaches almost inevitable. Until the structural and financial incentives actually shift to prioritize security over profit, we really have to ask ourselves, are the incredible conveniences of centralized cloud platforms actually worth the reality that a single point of failure can compromise millions of lives in an instant? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to break down the systems running our digital world.